My name is Nathaniel Carter, and though I am only 34 years old, my life has been defined by a single event that happened to me when I was just 12. I died. It wasn't a dream, nor was it a hallucination. I was clinically dead. What happened in those moments changed everything I knew about life, death, and the world beyond. I didn't just see the afterlife, I met Jesus Christ himself. He spoke to me, revealed secrets of the spiritual realm, and gave me a message meant not just for me but for the entire world. A message that will shake the very core of what you think you know about heaven, hell, and the purpose of human existence. But before I share this divine revelation, let me take you back to the day it all began, the day I died. Nathaniel was just 12 years old when his life took a turn no one could have ever anticipated. He was an ordinary boy, full of dreams, laughter, and the kind of energy that only children possess. His parents, deeply devoted to their faith, often spoke about God, heaven, and the unseen realms. But to Nathaniel, these were just distant concepts, stories told in church, words written in an ancient book. He never truly questioned them, but he had also never felt them in a way that would make them real. It was an ordinary evening, the kind where life felt steady, predictable. Nathaniel had just finished playing outside with his friends, racing through the streets on his bicycle, the wind brushing against his face, the sky turning from blue to shades of orange and pink. The smell of dinner drifted through the neighborhood, and the world felt warm, safe. He pedaled home, unaware that in just a few short hours, his name would be whispered in desperate prayers, his parents would weep, and doctors would struggle to understand how a healthy 12-year-old boy could suddenly be caught between life and death. That night, everything changed. It started as a headache, a sharp, pounding, relentless. Nathaniel tried to shake it off, thinking it was just exhaustion from a long day. His mother noticed him rubbing his temples and asked if he was okay. He nodded, not wanting to worry her. But as the night went on, the pain escalated, turning into something far more severe than anything he had ever felt before. He stumbled toward the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as his vision blurred. The world around him wavered, as though reality itself was slipping away. He called out for his parents, but the words felt heavy, lost somewhere between his mind and his mouth. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed. His mother screamed his name, rushing to his side, her hands shaking as she cradled his face. His father grabbed the phone, dialing for help, his voice breaking as he pleaded with the dispatcher to send an ambulance immediately. Nathaniel could hear them, but they sounded distant, as if he were underwater, drowning in a sea of confusion. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, then slowed. He gasped, struggling to breathe, his body growing cold. The last thing he saw before everything faded was his mother's tear-streaked face, her lips moving in frantic prayer. Darkness swallowed him. Time became meaningless. There was no pain, no fear, only an overwhelming silence. He was floating, weightless, unbound by the heaviness of his earthly body. At first, he thought it was a dream. But the more he drifted, the more he realized this was something else entirely. He looked down, and what he saw sent a chill through his very soul. His body lay lifeless on the kitchen floor. His mother clutched his hand, sobbing, while paramedics rushed in, pushing past his panicked father. They worked frantically, their voices sharp with urgency. One of them pressed on his chest, another placed an oxygen mask over his face. But it was useless. He was gone. Nathaniel wanted to scream, to tell them he was still here, but no one could hear him. His voice didn't exist in this new reality. He reached out, trying to touch his mother, but his hand passed through her like mist. A strange sensation pulled at him, a force beyond anything he could comprehend. It was as though invisible hands were drawing him away from the scene, lifting him higher and higher. The farther he went, the more the world below began to fade. The sounds of sirens, his mother's wails, the desperate attempts of the paramedics, it all became distant, then vanished entirely. A new presence surrounded him. It was warm, comforting, unlike anything he had ever felt before. He realized he was no longer in his house, no longer bound by the limitations of his physical body. He turned, and before him stretched a vast expanse of radiant light. It wasn't like the sun, blinding and harsh, but soft, welcoming, pure. It pulsed with a life of its own, drawing him in, and then, For the first time since his heart had stopped beating, he felt something he had never known before. A presence. It was powerful, overwhelming, yet filled with an indescribable love. It called to him, not with words, but with something deeper, something that spoke directly to his very soul. He had no doubt in his mind that whatever this was, it was beyond anything earthly, beyond human understanding. He wasn't afraid. If anything, he felt a broken bar home. Nathaniel felt himself being drawn forward, carried by an unseen force. There was no ground beneath him, yet he moved effortlessly, gliding through an endless expanse that stretched beyond his comprehension. It was neither day nor night, neither sky nor earth, it was something else entirely. The air around him pulsed with warmth, yet there was no heat. He sensed he was somewhere beyond the limits of human experience, a place untouched by time. As he drifted, his senses heightened. Sounds unlike anything he had ever heard filled the space around him, gentle, harmonious, yet carrying a weight of power. It wasn't music in the way he understood it, but something purer, deeper, like creation itself was singing. Colors beyond the spectrum of the natural world shimmered in the distance, shifting with each passing moment. The atmosphere felt alive, as if every particle held meaning. Every movement was part of something greater. A soft glow surrounded him, growing brighter with each passing second. He felt no fear, only an inexplicable peace, a serenity that went beyond emotion. The weight of earthly worries, childhood fears, and unspoken doubts had vanished. For the first time in his existence, he felt whole. Then, a shift. The light before him stretched and parted, revealing what seemed like a passageway, vast and endless. He hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because something in him recognized the significance of this moment. He wasn't dreaming. He wasn't imagining this. He was truly here, wherever here was. As he moved forward, he became aware of shadows taking form in the distance. They were not frightening, nor were they ominous. Instead, they radiated something familiar, something human. He could see figures, outlines of people walking ahead, their movements fluid, almost weightless. They weren't lost souls or wandering spirits. They carried a sense of purpose, as if they belonged to this place, as if they had always belonged. A strange recognition stirred within him. He didn't know these people, yet they felt familiar, like a distant memory buried deep within his soul. Some were turned away, their faces obscured by the glow surrounding them, but he could feel their presence as clearly as he could feel his own. They weren't strangers, they were a broken bar home. Then, one of them turned. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat, though he no longer had lungs in the way he once did. It was a woman, her face illuminated by a light that didn't come from any sun or fire. She looked at him with eyes that held eternity within them, eyes that saw beyond his physical being, beyond the child he had been and the world he left behind. There was no sadness in her expression, no pain, only an overwhelming sense of love. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that spoke of reunions, of joy untainted by the burdens of earthly existence. He wanted to move toward her, to ask who she was, why she felt so familiar, but before he could, she placed a hand over her heart in a gesture of peace, of acknowledgement, and then, she was gone, fading into the golden horizon as if she had never been there at all. Nathaniel wanted to call out, to ask what was happening, but before he could, he became aware of something else, something greater than anything he had felt before. A presence. It was not like the figures he had seen before. This was different. It filled the entire space. Though it had no distinct form, it was everywhere, in everything, yet its power did not overwhelm it embraced. It was gentle, yet unshakable. It was vast, yet close enough to feel as if it were wrapped around him like a protective embrace. He felt it before he saw it, a light, brighter than anything he had encountered, yet not harsh. It did not burn his eyes or force him to turn away. Instead, it drew him in, calling to him in a way that words could never capture. And then, from within the light, a voice. It was not like the voices he had known on earth, not spoken through lips and breath. It was deeper, more resonant, like it came from inside him rather than from outside. It carried weight, a gravity that made the very fabric of this reality tremble. It was neither loud nor quiet, but it commanded everything around it. Nathaniel, the voice called. It knew his name, not just the name given to him by his parents, but the name buried deep within his soul, the name that existed before the world had shaped him, before time had touched him. It spoke to the core of who he was, to something beyond flesh and bone. He felt himself kneel, though he hadn't chosen to. It was instinctive, automatic, as though every fiber of his being understood who he was in the presence of. "Nathaniel," the voice spoke again, softer this time, but no less powerful. It was not a question, it was a calling, a recognition, and then, from within the endless radiance, a figure emerged. Nathaniel watched as the radiant figure stepped forward, emerging from the boundless light like the dawn breaking over an infinite horizon. His very presence shifted everything around him. It was not just light that radiated from him, but something deeper, something living. It was power and peace interwoven, a force that could command the stars and yet whisper to the smallest soul. Nathaniel did not need to be told who he was. He knew. It was Jesus. There was no mistaking it. This was not the figure from the paintings in church, not the image described in Sunday school. This was something beyond imagination, beyond human artistry. His eyes held eternity within them, burning with a fire that was both fierce and tender. His presence was not just seen, it was felt. It flowed through the air, through Nathaniel's very being, as if every particle of existence recognized him and bowed in reverence. Nathaniel wanted to speak, to ask where he was, why he was here, but before he could form the words, he realized he had no need to. Jesus already knew. His gaze carried an understanding so complete, so total, that words would have been unnecessary. Nathaniel felt exposed, not in a way that brought shame, but in a way that stripped him of all pretense, all masks, leaving only his true self standing before the King of Kings. Jesus reached out a hand, and though he was not touching him in the physical sense, Nathaniel felt something indescribable wash over him. It was warmth, but more than warmth. It was love, but more than love. It was something that transcended every emotion, every feeling he had ever known. It was as if his soul had been fractured all his life, and only now, in this moment, was he being made whole. "Nathaniel," Jesus spoke his name, and the very sound of it held power. It wasn't just a name, it was an identity, a purpose, a recognition of something far greater than himself. The voice of Jesus did not come as mere sound wave as it resonated inside him, in the deepest parts of his existence, where doubt and fear once lingered. It drove out every shadow, every uncertainty. "You have been brought here for a reason." Nathaniel's heart, or whatever essence he now had in this form, it trembled. He did not ask what the reason was. He simply listened. Jesus turned slightly, and suddenly the space around them shifted. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing something beyond the light, beyond the infinite horizon Nathaniel had seen before. A vision unfolded before him, stretching out like a living tapestry, woven together with scenes of earth, of heaven, of the unseen forces that governed reality. He saw the world, but not as he had known it before. He saw people walking, living their lives, unaware of the spiritual battle raging around them. He saw light and darkness intertwined, forces moving beyond human sight, shaping events, influencing choices. He saw angels standing guard, their presence unseen yet undeniable, their swords gleaming with divine fire. He saw shadows lurking, whispering into the ears of the lost, planting seeds of doubt, of fear, of destruction. The weight of it all pressed upon him. He saw prayers rising like golden smoke, weaving through the heavens, reaching places he could not yet comprehend. He saw moments of faith, small and quiet, creating ripples that turned into waves of change. He saw people on their knees, crying out for something more, for answers, for truth. He saw hands reaching for the divine, and he saw hands turning away. And then, he saw something else. He saw time, or at least, something that resembled time. It was not linear, not bound by hours or days. It was like threads woven together, forming patterns that Nathaniel could barely grasp. He saw glimpses of the past, of the present, of a future that was yet unwritten. He saw choices branching out, leading to paths of light and paths of darkness. Jesus turned back to him, his expression unreadable yet filled with an unfathomable depth. Nathaniel felt the question before it was spoken. "What do you see?" Nathaniel swallowed, or at least, he felt the sensation of swallowing, though he was no longer confined to a physical body. "I see a broken bar. Everything, he whispered. Jesus nodded, his gaze never leaving Nathanael's. "And what do you understand?" Nathanael struggled to find the words. The visions had been too vast, too overwhelming, but something deep within him knew what this was, what it meant. "There's more," he finally said. "More than what we see, more than what we understand." Jesus smiled, though there was sadness in his eyes. Not a sadness of despair, but of longing. "The world has forgotten." His voice was steady, yet filled with sorrow. "Many walk in darkness, believing they walk in light. They seek truth, yet turn away from it when it is given to them. They have ears but do not hear, eyes but do not see." Nathanael felt the weight of those words settle upon him. He thought of his own life, of how he had never truly questioned, never truly sought. He had believed, but in the way a child believes in things simply because they are told to. He had never truly understood. Jesus raised his hand again, and a new vision appeared. It was the world as it was now, a broken, divided, longing for something more. He saw people drowning in distractions, searching for fulfillment in things that could never satisfy. He saw nations rising against each other, hearts growing cold, truth being twisted into something unrecognizable. He saw the deception, the blindness, the chains that bound so many, and then, he saw something else. He saw hope, a spark, small at first, but growing, a light in the darkness, a remnant of those who still sought, who still listened, who still carried the truth. He saw voices rising, hearts awakening, a call spreading across the world. It was not loud, not forceful, but it was unshakable. It could not be extinguished. Jesus turned to him once more. Nathanael knew, in that moment, that what he was about to hear would change everything. Nathanael felt the weight of the moment pressing upon him, though it was not the kind of weight that burdened it. It was something greater, something sacred. Jesus stood before him, the lights surrounding him shifting like waves of liquid gold, radiating warmth that penetrated the very core of Nathanael's being. Every fiber of his soul understood that whatever was about to happen would mark him forever. There was no time in this place, no past or future, only an eternal present. Yet he felt something pulling him, something urging him to remember, to carry all he had seen, all he had heard, back with him. The thought unsettled him. He didn't want to leave. How could he return to the world after experiencing this? How could he go back to the mundane, to the ordinary, when he had seen the extraordinary? Jesus looked at him with an expression of infinite understanding, as if he already knew every thought running through his mind before they had even formed. His eyes held something that could not be put into words, of both sorrow and joy, both longing and fulfillment. Nathanael felt exposed under that gaze, as if everything he had ever been, every secret, every hidden doubt, every unspoken fear, was known. Yet there was no condemnation in Jesus' eyes, only love. "You must go back." The words were not harsh, nor were they spoken with force, but they carried an authority that could not be questioned. They echoed inside him, resonating not just in his ears but in his very soul. He opened his mouth to protest, to say that he didn't want to return, but before he could speak, Jesus raised his hand, and suddenly everything around them shifted once more. Nathanael saw his own body. It was still lying on the cold kitchen floor, paramedics moving around it with frantic urgency. His mother was sobbing uncontrollably, her face buried in his father's chest. His father, usually so strong, was gripping her tightly, his own eyes brimming with tears. The scene felt distant, almost unreal, like watching a movie that had no connection to him. Yet he knew, deep down, that it was real. That body was his. That life was his. He turned back to Jesus, his heart pounding with something that resembled fear. He didn't want to leave this place. He didn't want to return to pain, to struggle, to a world that now seemed so small compared to what he had seen. Why? His voice was barely more than a whisper, yet he knew Jesus heard him. Jesus did not answer immediately. Instead, he extended his hand, and as soon as Nathanael looked into it, a new vision unfolded before him. He saw himself older, standing before crowds of people, speaking words he had not yet spoken. He saw lives being changed, hearts being opened. He saw the ripple effects of his return spreading, reaching people he had never met, places he had never been. He saw a man on the verge of ending his own life, only to stop because of something Nathanael had said. He saw a child, lost and afraid, finding hope because of the message he carried. He saw people whose faith had been fading suddenly igniting with a new fire, a new urgency. He saw himself as a voice, a messenger, not for his own glory, but for something far greater. "You were chosen," Jesus said, his voice filled with both gentleness and power, "not for your own sake, but for theirs." Nathanael swallowed hard, the weight of those words sinking in. He thought of all the people who had never seen what he had seen, who had never stood in the presence of Jesus, who had never heard the voice that spoke with such undeniable truth. He thought of the world he was leaving behind, a world filled with doubt, with fear, with endless distractions pulling people away from what truly mattered. If he did not return, who would tell them, who would warn them, who would show them that there was more? A deep ache settled within him, an ache not for himself, but for those who were still lost. He understood now, this experience was not meant for him alone, it was meant to be shared. Jesus stepped closer, placing his hand on Nathanael's shoulder. The touch sent a warmth through him, unlike anything he had ever felt. It was not just comforting, it was strengthening. He knew, in that moment, that when he returned, he would not be the same. He could never be the same. "You will not be alone." The words were simple, yet they carried a promise that was unshakable. Nathanael knew, without a doubt, that Jesus meant them. Whatever was waiting for him back in the world, whatever challenges he would face, whatever disbelief, whatever ridicule, he would never face it alone. The light around them began to shift again, and Nathanael felt something pulling at him, and not physically, but spiritually. He felt his very essence being drawn away, being pulled back toward the body he had left behind. The warmth of this place, the music of creation, the presence of Jesus, it all began to fade, yet it did not feel like a loss. He was being sent. He was being sent with a purpose, a mission, a truth that would shake the foundations of those who heard it. Nathanael took one last look at Jesus, wanting to etch every detail into his memory, to carry it with him forever. The light in Jesus' eyes, the depth of his love, the certainty of his clean, it would all remain with him, even when he awoke in a world that no longer felt like home. He felt himself slipping away, the presence of heaven growing distant, the weight of his earthly body pulling him back, and then, in an instant, everything went dark. Nathanael gasped as his eyes flew open, his lungs seizing as if he had just broken through the surface of deep water after drowning. His chest rose and fell in uneven, ragged breaths. The light of the kitchen ceiling was harsh compared to the radiant glow he had just left behind. His body felt heavy, foreign, like it had been stitched back together from something that was never meant to return. Sounds flooded his ears, of voices shouting, his mother sobbing, a paramedic yelling orders. The room was spinning. Everything was too loud, too sharp. He could feel the cold of the floor beneath him, the weight of his limbs, the tightness in his chest. He had been gone. He had seen heaven. He had stood before Jesus. And now, he was back. His mother's face came into view, eyes red and swollen with tears. She let out a choked sob as she cupped his face, touching him as if to make sure he was real. "Nathanael, oh, my baby, oh God, you're here, you're here." The paramedics exchanged looks of astonishment, their hands frozen in the middle of their work. One of them, a middle-aged man with graying hair, stared at the monitor, shaking his head in disbelief. "He was gone," he muttered under his breath. "He was gone. Boot to broken bar, he's back." Nathanael blinked, his vision adjusting, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. His mother's hands trembled as they cradled him, and his father knelt beside them, gripping his arm as though afraid to let go. The kitchen that had once been so familiar now felt distant, as if it belonged to another life. He tried to speak, but his throat felt raw, his lips parted, but only a whisper escaped. "I saw him." His mother's face twisted in confusion, but before she could ask, he turned his head slightly toward his father. "I saw Jesus." Silence fell over the room. Even the paramedics paused, their expression shifting from professional concern to something deeper, something unspoken. The words felt too big to say, yet they carried a weight that could not be denied. He had been gone. He had met Jesus, and now he had returned with something more than just the memory of that encounter. His father swallowed hard, his grip tightening. "So broken bar, what are you saying?" Nathanael's breath was shaky, his mind still struggling to reconcile the reality he had just left with the one he had returned to. He had seen beyond the veil, beyond the boundaries of life and death, and now he was sitting here, surrounded by people who could never understand unless he told them, unless he made them see. "I died," he whispered, and his mother let out another sob. His father shut his eyes tightly, as if to steady himself, but Nathaniel continued, "I left my body. I saw you. I saw the paramedics trying to bring me back, but then I was a broken bar somewhere else." His mother shook her head in disbelief, her tears streaming freely. "No, baby, you were unconscious." "I wasn't unconscious," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice steadier now. "I was there. I saw heaven. I saw people I didn't know but who felt like I did. And then a broken bar. I saw him." His father's jaw clenched, his eyes searching Nathaniel's face for any sign of deception, of confusion, but he found none. "I saw Jesus." The paramedics glanced at each other uncomfortably, unsure whether to step away or stay. His mother's lips trembled, her face a mixture of wonder and terror. His father let out a slow, unsteady breath, his own eyes glistening. "What did he say?" Nathaniel's heart pounded. He could still feel Jesus' presence, as though a part of it had followed him back. He closed his eyes for a moment, grounding himself in the truth of what had been spoken to him, what had been shown to him. "He said the world has forgotten," Nathaniel said, his voice soft but sure, "that people think they walk in the light, but they are blind, that they search for truth but turn away from it when it's right in front of them." He looked at his father. "He showed me things, the battles we don't see, the prayers that rise like fire, the way darkness tries to cover everything." His mother's hands shook. His father swallowed hard. The paramedics had stopped moving altogether. Nathaniel's voice trembled, but he pressed on. "He showed me hope, too, that there are still those who hear, who listen, that even when it seems like the world is lost, he is still calling people back." His eyes burned with an intensity that did not belong to a 12-year-old boy. "He sent me back to tell people, to warn them, to wake them up." His father covered his mouth, staring at him as if he were seeing him for the first time. His mother wept silently, her fingers gripping his arm. The paramedics, men who had seen death, who had worked in the presence of tragedy countless times, looked shaken. One of them, the older man, finally found his voice. "Kid, broken bar. I've been doing this for 25 years. I know what death looks like." "You were dead." He rubbed his jaw, glancing at his partner. "But you came back." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And I believe you." Nathaniel held his gaze. "You should." His father finally moved, pulling him into a tight embrace, his body shaking. "My so broken bar, my son." His voice cracked, breaking under the weight of the moment. His mother joined, clinging to him as if afraid he would vanish again. Nathaniel closed his eyes, letting himself be held, but he knew this was only the beginning. This message was not just for his family, it was for the world, and somehow, he knew deep in his soul that not everyone would be ready to hear it.